picture this, right? A surgeon, 90 minutes into like a 6-hour operation. Everything's going perfectly, incisions clean, instruments are laid out by the book. But for the past 18 months, she's been sleeping only 4 hours a night. Not because of emergencies, but because she just can't stop checking the news before bed. She feels like it's always about to resolve into clarity, but it never does. And at hour 4 of that surgery, her fine motor decisions, they just start to degrade. Not because of anything in that operating room. It's because of a cognitive debt she's been racking up in her living room. And here's the kicker. She doesn't know it. The patient doesn't know it. The scalpel is steady. But the damage, it's invisible.
Oh, wow. Marcus, that's not a hypothetical, That's a measurable output of what the research in front of us calls the extraction loop. And what makes this really worth an episode isn't just the wellness angle, it's the structural one. This loop, it's not like a side effect of how these platforms were built, it's the core product. And right now, it's actually starting to lose its fuel supply. It's wild.
So you're saying it's by design, not an accident? And we're going to dig into how it actually works today?
Absolutely. You'll walk away identifying the exact mechanism by which your attention is being taxed, not as a metaphor, but as a documented behavioral sequence. And you'll have one structural change that actually reclaims it. Not just a tip, Something that works because it doesn't ask anything of your willpower.
So let's establish what's actually happening in the system, because the framing matters enormously here. The analysis we're working from, it opens with a line I haven't been able to get out of my head. You have spent some portion of this week consuming information about things you cannot change, and the consumption has cost you something without returning anything. And then it says, that is not anxiety. That is accurate accounting.
Whoa, accurate accounting. That phrase is doing serious work there, isn't it? What's it naming specifically?
It's naming the clinical finding that rumination, sustained attention on a problem you can't directly resolve, actively reduces your problem-solving efficiency. Not through distraction or conventional fatigue. It's through a specific mechanism. The cognitive load of fixation actually consumes the bandwidth that would otherwise generate solutions to the problems you can fix. And the neuroscience on the brain's default mode network just sharpens this further. When you disengage from an active, unresolvable problem, not ignore it, but disengage, the brain's background processing system activates. It starts correlating information across time, running pattern recognition across separate memory stores. That insight you get in the shower, that's not an accident. It's the output of a system that can only operate when the threat detection apparatus isn't fully occupied.
So, the news cycle running in your background isn't actually informing your decisions. It's crowding out the cognitive process by which you make better ones, right? But, a lot of people know this, and they keep doing it anyway. That gap between what you know and what you do, that's not just ignorance, is it? It needs a different explanation.
Exactly. And that's exactly where the extraction loop comes in. The loop, it's engineered, not accidental. External instability drives information consumption. That consumption then generates an engagement signal. That engagement signal incentivizes more instability content. More instability content amplifies perceived risk.
And here's what the data isn't saying, but it's very clearly implying. 2 numbers arrived this week that together are more revealing than anything in the institutional narrative. Meta quietly acknowledged that 84% of videos on its platforms are not watched past 3 seconds, and the Financial Times data shows that global social media time peaked in 2022 and has been declining since, with the steepest drops among the youngest users. The generation that was raised inside this extraction loop.
Okay, those 2 numbers, they aren't telling the same story. Let's be precise.
No, they're not. The 3-second figure is a supply-side crisis signal. The platform is flooding the zone, and the content is just failing to capture. That's not user sophistication, right? That's overstimulation producing blunting. When you expose someone to 1,000 stimuli in rapid succession, the threshold for engagement rises.
Eventually, the signal that used to provoke a response just requires more intensity to produce the same effect. The platforms aren't getting smarter about content. They're turning up the volume on a system whose listeners are just going progressively deaf to it.
And the 2022 peak, the declining time on platform among young users specifically.
That's the behavioral withdrawal the analysis is tracking. What's so striking is the demography. The generation that had the most to lose from disengagement, whose entire social infrastructure lived inside these platforms, is the one pulling away first. They didn't arrive at it through philosophy, you know? They arrived at it through saturation. They burned through the loop's fuel faster than anyone predicted.
So, the dominant institutional bet right now, especially around like the 2026 recession narrative, it's pricing in a structural collapse of consumer behavior driven by collective anxiety. The public forecast assumes people are paralyzed, that uncertainty produces behavioral freeze. But the private price tells a different story. Capital's moving away from centralized, leveraged exposure and toward localized hard asset positions, not because people are optimistic about macro conditions, but because they've stopped anchoring their decisions to the macro signal. And the analysis puts the private price roughly 12 to 18 months ahead of the public narrative on this divergence. The gap is directional, not random.
Think about what that looks like as a behavioral change. Someone who, like 12 months ago, was checking market news 4 times a day and making reactive decisions is now paying down debt, investing in local infrastructure, starting a business decoupled from the indices they used to track obsessively. They're not tuning out. They are reinvesting cognitive capital in a domain they can actually affect. And here's where the algorithmic blind spot becomes structurally significant. Predictive models are built on signals. A click is a signal. Even active resistance, a furious comment, sustained engagement with content you hate, that's a signal. The algorithm can map defiance. It can categorize your emotional reactions, model your boundaries, optimize around them. Defiance is legible. What the algorithm cannot process is silence. A person who puts the phone in a drawer and goes outside produces a null value. The model has no mathematical framework for the absence of a coordinate.
Which means the behavioral withdrawal happening right now is, from the platform's perspective, operationally indistinguishable from, like, a catastrophic infrastructure failure. And that explains something a lot of people have noticed but couldn't quite account for. The information environment feels more aggressive right now, not less. The notifications are more insistent, the rhetoric is more extreme, the urgency has been cranked past the point of credibility. The instinct is to read that as institutional confidence, peak power. But the structural read is the opposite. That's what a supply shortage looks like in a system that requires constant anxiety to run. They're not turning up the heat because they're winning. They're turning it up because the room is starting to cool.
Exactly. Now, I want to crack something open because this analysis has a load-bearing assumption it leaves unexamined. The entire structural pivot case rests on the claim that willpower interventions fail under cognitive load, but structural interventions succeed because they offload the decision to the environment. And the research supports that distinction. What I don't accept is the implicit claim that silence, disengagement, and internal anchoring are neutral acts. The piece treats withdrawal as the clean move. I think that needs real pressure.
Say more about that.
Well, the analysis frames algorithmic silence as non-participation. You step outside the extraction loop, you stop feeding the machine, you reclaim your cognitive bandwidth. But silence in a system of managed conflict is itself a political act, whether or not you intend it that way. The populations that historically had the least access to information, the least ability to track systemic risk, they didn't benefit from detachment. Structural disengagement isn't symmetrically available, you know? It's substantially easier for people who've already achieved a baseline of economic stability. If your life is genuinely precarious, if your circumstances are directly affected by policy decisions you can't influence without collective action, the prescription to protect your cognitive bandwidth by disengaging from the system extracting it runs into a genuine tension. The loop is extractive, but the information that runs through it is sometimes real and sometimes consequential, and you can't always cleanly separate the two.
That is the sharpest challenge to this framework. And the piece, it doesn't address it directly, but I want to steel man the response because I think a distinction is being collapsed here. The withdrawal being described isn't a withdrawal from civic engagement, from community participation, or from informed decision-making at the local level. It's a withdrawal from the specific product of the extraction loop, the managed anxiety cycle, the reactive processing of global crises that are structurally beyond individual resolution. Those are just not the same thing, you know?
In principle, totally agreed. The question, though, is whether ordinary people can make that cut cleanly. Because the loop doesn't run on separate infrastructure, it runs on the same rails as legitimate political information.
And that's where the structural intervention becomes concrete rather than aspirational. The prescription isn't to go dark on all information. It's to make reactive access structurally harder. Blockers at the router level, physical distance from the device, charging the phone in another room, so that the decision to engage actually requires intentional effort rather than defaulting to compulsion. The difference between "I am checking this because I chose to" and "I am checking this because the notification appeared and I grabbed the phone without deciding to," that's the entire difference in cognitive load.
And the research on structural versus willpower interventions is clear. Adoption rates for structural changes are significantly higher precisely because they don't require a fresh decision every time under degraded conditions. You're not relying on discipline in the moment. You're resting on a choice made in advance, from a position of clarity that you don't have to remake when the notification fires. What I will leave on the table, though, is this. The structural pivot assumes you have enough baseline stability that your most urgent problems are solvable by you. For people in genuinely precarious circumstances, that assumption does real work. The piece doesn't resolve that tension. I don't think this episode fully resolves it either, but naming it is the minimum.
So, here's what the episode produced, stated plainly. The exhaustion you feel navigating the current information environment is not a character failure. It is the expected output of a system running on managed anxiety as a primary resource. The loop isn't broken, the loop is succeeding, and the structural audit shows it is beginning to encounter a supply constraint. Enough people have reached saturation that the behavioral withdrawal is now measurable in platform engagement data, in capital flows, in the gap between what institutions are pricing and where the actual consequence is accumulating. The actionable frame is this. You are not choosing between awareness and ignorance. You are choosing which inputs your decisions are actually anchored to. Above a certain threshold of ambient uncertainty, more information degrades decision quality. That is not a philosophical position. The mechanism is cognitive load saturation, and it is documented. The intervention that works is structural, not willpower-based. Make access require a decision. Remove the default path of least resistance. Do it once from a position of clarity, so you don't have to do it again under load.
And the analysis identifies a convergence point in November 2026, when institutional pressure cycles across political, regulatory, and economic domains peak simultaneously and require individuals to either increase their reactive engagement or demonstrate in aggregate they've restructured their decision-making away from it. The outcome won't be determined by what happens in the world between now and then, you know? It'll be determined by the accumulation of individual attention decisions made in the intervening weeks, each one invisible to any institutional measurement system, each one either feeding the loop or building the capacity outside it. But here's what I cannot stop thinking about, Marcus. What if, like a few years from now, the platforms figure out how to commercialize the disengagement itself? What if they find a way to package your desire for genuine quiet, your hunger for internal stability, your need to feel like you have your attention back, and sell it to you as a premium subscription? Because that wouldn't be the failure of the structural pivot. That would be the extraction loop completing its next evolution. The loop doesn't require anxiety as its permanent input. It only requires something you want badly enough to buy. And right now, what a growing number of people want most is to feel like they got out.
Wow. The breakpoint is not an event. It is a threshold. And that threshold is currently priced at 0. That's chilling.